The girl who wrote letters from the dead the morning of October 15, 1890, began like any other in the grimy industrial heart of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Factory whistles shrieked through the dawn mist, calling workers to another day of backbreaking labor in the steel mills that lined the Susquehanna River. But in the modest boarding house on 3rd Street, landlady Miss Catherine Whitmore discovered something that would shake the foundations of everything she thought she knew about life, death, and the thin veil between worlds. Tucked beneath her front door was an envelope, cream-colored and sealed with red wax. The address, written in an elegant hand that seemed far too mature for its years, read simply, "For Thomas Whitmore, late of this world." Thomas had been Catherine's husband. He had been dead for 18 months. Inside, written in the same careful script, was a letter that would launch one of the most disturbing and inexplicable cases in American supernatural history. The message, signed, "Your loving husband," contained intimate details about their marriage that no living soul could have known. The pet name he called her in private, the location of money he had hidden before his death, and most chilling of all, an apology for the terrible cold he now endured in this place between places. Before we continue, if you enjoy uncovering these dark and forgotten chapters of history, make sure to subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us bring more of these stories to light. The letter was signed at the bottom with a small notation, written by the hand of E. Boone, as dictated by the departed. Miss Whitmore knew that name. Everyone in their cramped neighborhood knew Eliza Boone, the peculiar 14-year-old girl who lived 3 houses down with her seamstress mother and railroad clerk father. The child who spent her days filling notebook after notebook with poems and sketches, who rarely spoke above a whisper, and whose pale gray eyes seemed to see things others could not. What Miss Whitmore didn't know was that her letter was only the beginning. The industrial Gothic of 1890s Harrisburg, to understand how a young girl's strange gift could terrorize an entire community, one must first understand the world in which Eliza Boone lived. Harrisburg in 1890 was a city caught between two ages, the pastoral Pennsylvania of the early republic and the smoke-belching industrial powerhouse it was rapidly becoming. The population had swelled to nearly 40,000 souls, most of them drawn by the promise of steady work in the expanding steel mills, railroad yards, and textile factories that had transformed the once quiet state capital into a hub of American industry. But progress came at a cost. The air hung thick with coal smoke and the metallic tang of molten steel. The Susquehanna River, once clear enough to drink from, now ran the color of rust from the industrial runoff. Families crowded into narrow row houses and cramped boarding establishments, often 3 or 4 to a room. Disease spread quickly in such conditions. Cholera, typhoid, and consumption claimed lives with ruthless efficiency. Particularly among the poor, death was a constant companion in this world. The average family could expect to lose at least one child before their 5th birthday. Industrial accidents maimed or killed workers with grim regularity. In the winter of 1889 alone, the Harrisburg Telegraph recorded over 200 deaths from various causes in a city of 40,000, a mortality rate that would seem shocking today, but was grimly accepted as the price of modern life. It was into this world of smoke, sorrow, and sudden death that Eliza Boone had been born on a cold February morning in 1876. Her father, Marcus Boone, worked as a timekeeper for the Pennsylvania Railroad, earning the respectable but modest sum of $12 per week. Her mother, Sarah, took in sewing to supplement the family income, her fingers flying over delicate lacework late into the night by the light of a single kerosene lamp. The Boones were what the census takers called native white stock, neither wealthy enough to live in the grand mansions on Front Street, nor poor enough to crowd into the immigrant tenements near the river. They occupied that precarious middle ground of the working class, always one accident or illness away from destitution. Yet proud of their respectability and their small but tidy home on Walnut Street. Eliza had been a quiet child from birth, her mother would later recall. While other children played noisily in the streets, dodging horse-drawn wagons and chasing hoops with sticks, Eliza preferred to sit by the window with her notebooks, writing in a script that seemed impossibly mature for her age. She had taught herself to read before her 4th birthday, devouring every book she could find: the family Bible, her father's railroad manuals, even the serialized novels in the ladies' magazines her mother occasionally purchased. By age 10, Eliza was writing her own stories and poems, tales of far-off places and people she had never met but described with uncanny accuracy. Her teachers at the local public school praised her intelligence but noted her tendency to drift away during lessons, staring out the window as if listening to voices only she could hear. Her classmates found her strange and kept their distance, put off by her pale complexion, her old-fashioned way of speaking, and the intensity of her gray eyes. "She always seemed to be looking through you," one former classmate would recall decades later. "Like she could see something standing right behind you that you couldn't see yourself." The first manifestations, the earliest signs that Eliza Boone possessed an unusual gift or curse, appeared in the spring of 1889 when she was 13 years old. It began innocuously enough, with small acts of kindness that seemed to demonstrate an impossible knowledge of her neighbors' private griefs. Miss Helena Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who lived 2 streets over, had lost her infant son to diphtheria the previous winter. She spoke little English and kept to herself, mourning alone in the tiny apartment she shared with her husband, a laborer at the Harrisburg steel works. One morning, she found a small bouquet of wildflowers on her doorstep, accompanied by a note written in careful English. "Little Pavel watches over you from the Garden of Angels. He says to tell you he is warm now and no longer coughs." Miss Kowalski had never told anyone her baby's name. The death certificate listed him simply as Baby Kowalski. Yet somehow, this anonymous note writer knew not only his name but also the terrible coughing fits that had marked his final days. When she inquired among her neighbors, several remembered seeing a pale, thin girl with dark hair gathering flowers in the vacant lot behind the tenements. The description matched Eliza Boone perfectly. Similar incidents multiplied throughout that spring and summer. A widowed shopkeeper found a poem slipped under his door, written from the perspective of his late wife and referencing a private joke they had shared during their courtship. An elderly man discovered a note in his coat pocket after church, signed by his brother who had died in the Civil War 25 years earlier, apologizing for the harsh words spoken before Antietam. At first, these messages were received as acts of compassion, even if their origin remained mysterious. The recipients assumed someone in the community, perhaps the minister's wife or one of the charitable ladies from the Methodist Church, had learned of their losses and was trying to provide comfort through these anonymous notes. The fact that they were written in what appeared to be a child's handwriting only added to their poignant charm. But as autumn arrived and the messages continued, their tone began to shift. The comfort offered in the early notes gave way to something more unsettling, details that no living person should have known, references to private moments and secret shames that the dead had taken with them to their graves. The revelation, the truth about Eliza's involvement, came to light in November of 1889, when Miss Whitmore's next-door neighbor, a sharp-eyed Irish woman named Bridget O'Malley, claimed to have witnessed something extraordinary. According to Miss O'Malley's sworn statement to the local constable, she had been unable to sleep due to her husband's snoring and had risen before dawn to start her baking. Glancing out her kitchen window, she saw a figure moving through the pre-dawn darkness, slipping letters under doors and into mailboxes along the street. The figure was unmistakably that of young Eliza Boone, dressed in a white nightgown and moving with an odd, dreamlike quality that Miss O'Malley later described as like she was walking underwater. Most disturbing of all, the woman claimed that Eliza's lips were moving constantly, as if she were carrying on a conversation with invisible companions. When confronted the next day by Miss O'Malley and several other neighbors, Eliza's parents were initially defensive, insisting their daughter had been asleep in her bed all night. But faced with mounting evidence, including the fact that several of the mysterious letters bore Eliza's distinctive handwriting, they were forced to acknowledge that something unusual was indeed happening. Marcus Boone, a practical man who prided himself on his rational approach to life's problems, attempted to dismiss the whole affair as childish pranks. Perhaps Eliza had been listening at keyholes and windows, gathering gossip to weave into her letters. Perhaps she had been reading old newspapers and death notices, collecting information about the deceased to use in her elaborate hoax. But this explanation crumbled when faced with the specificity and intimacy of the information contained in Eliza's letters. How could a 14-year-old girl know about the secret drinking problem that had plagued a man who died before she was born? How could she describe the exact words spoken during a deathbed confession that had been witnessed by only one person, who had never shared the story with another living soul? When pressed for an explanation, Eliza herself provided answers that only deepened the mystery. In a voice barely above a whisper, she told the assembled adults that she had no conscious memory of writing the letters. She claimed that she would go to sleep normally, only to wake up in the morning with ink stains on her fingers and fresh pages of writing on her desk, writing that she recognized as her own hand but could not remember producing. "They come to me in the dark hours," she said, her pale eyes fixed on something beyond the faces surrounding her. "They have so much to say, so many things left unfinished. They whisper and whisper until I take up my pen, and then the words flow through me like water through a pipe. I am only the vessel, they the winter of whispers." As 1889 gave way to 1890, Eliza's nocturnal activities intensified. What had begun as occasional letters became a nightly occurrence, with messages appearing throughout the neighborhood like fallen leaves after a storm. The content of these communications grew increasingly specific and disturbing, containing information that seemed impossible for any living person to possess. A letter addressed to Miss Margaret Sullivan, whose husband had died in a mining accident 5 years earlier, contained a detailed description of his final moments underground. The sound of creaking timbers, the taste of coal dust in his mouth, the prayer he had whispered as the tunnel collapsed around him. Miss Sullivan had never been told these details by the other miners who had recovered his body, yet the letter described them with heartbreaking accuracy. Another message, left for the town's elderly doctor, was signed by a patient who had died of cancer the previous year. The letter thanked the physician for his kindness during the woman's final illness, but also reproached him for the morphine he had secretly added to her medicine in her last days, a mercy that had eased her passing but violated his own stated principles about the sanctity of natural death. Dr. Henshaw had never told anyone about his decision to help the woman die peacefully, yet somehow Eliza's pen had recorded his guilty secret. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the letter received by Judge William Crawford, a respected member of the community who served on the county court. The message, supposedly written by a man Crawford had sentenced to death 15 years earlier, contained not accusations or curses but forgiveness, and a detailed account of what the condemned man claimed to have witnessed from the other side. During Crawford's subsequent legal career, the letter referenced specific cases, private deliberations, and moral compromises that only Crawford himself could have known about. The judge, a man known for his unshakable composure on the bench, was reportedly so shaken by the letter that he took to his bed for 3 days, claiming illness. When he finally emerged, neighbors noted that his hair had gone completely white and that he jumped at shadows, constantly looking over his shoulder as if expecting to see someone standing behind him. The investigation begins by the spring of 1890. The situation had attracted the attention of authorities beyond the local neighborhood. The Harrisburg Telegraph ran a series of articles about the mysterious letter writer of 3rd Street, drawing curious visitors from as far away as Philadelphia and New York. Some came seeking to debunk what they assumed was an elaborate hoax. Others arrived hoping to witness genuine supernatural phenomena. Among the investigators was Dr. Edmund Hartwell, a professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania who had made a name for himself studying cases of alleged mediumship and psychical phenomena. Dr. Hartwell spent 2 weeks in Harrisburg during April of 1890, interviewing witnesses, examining the letters, and observing Eliza herself. His initial report, published in the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research, documented the case with scientific precision. He noted that the letters were indeed written in Eliza's hand, a fact confirmed through careful comparison with her school exercises and personal correspondence. He verified that many of the details contained in the messages could not have been known through normal means, having been corroborated by multiple independent sources. Most intriguingly, Dr. Hartwell arranged to observe Eliza during one of her alleged writing sessions. On the night of April 23, 1890, he concealed himself in the Boone family's parlor with the parents' permission, hoping to witness the girl's mysterious nocturnal activities firsthand. According to his detailed notes, Eliza rose from her bed at approximately 2 a.m., moving with the slow, mechanical gait of a sleepwalker. Her eyes were open but unfocused, and she seemed unaware of his presence, despite passing within inches of his hiding place behind a large armchair. She seated herself at the family's writing desk and began to write with fluid, rapid strokes, her pen moving across the paper without pause or hesitation. Dr. Hartwell observed that Eliza's lips moved constantly as she wrote, though no sound emerged. Occasionally, she would pause and tilt her head as if listening to something, then nod and resume writing with renewed urgency. The entire process lasted approximately 45 minutes, during which she produced 7 complete letters addressed to various deceased individuals. When she finished, Eliza carefully folded each letter, placed them in envelopes that she addressed with the same flowing script, and then returned to her bed. Throughout the entire episode, she showed no sign of conscious awareness, and when questioned the following morning, she claimed to have no memory of the night's activities. Dr. Hartwell's attempts to wake Eliza during her writing sessions proved unsuccessful. She seemed to exist in a trance state so deep that even physical contact failed to rouse her. On one occasion, he deliberately knocked over a chair near her desk, creating a loud crash that should have startled anyone awake. Eliza continued writing without so much as a pause, as if the sound had occurred in another world entirely. The content of the letters. As Dr. Hartwell's investigation continued, he began to analyze not just the circumstances of the letters' creation, but their content as well. What he discovered challenged his scientific worldview in ways he had not anticipated. The letters fell into several distinct categories. Some were simple messages of comfort and reassurance, written by deceased family members to their surviving relatives. These typically contained expressions of love, forgiveness for past grievances, and assurances that death was not the end but merely a transition to another form of existence. A second category consisted of what Dr. Hartwell termed unfinished business, communications, messages from the dead attempting to resolve matters they had left incomplete in life. These might include instructions about hidden valuables, confessions of long-kept secrets, or apologies for wrongs committed before death. Most disturbing were the letters in a third category, which Dr. Hartwell privately labeled warnings from beyond. These messages, often written in urgent, almost frantic script, contained warnings about future events or revelations about hidden dangers in the present. A letter supposedly from a woman who had died in a house fire warned her surviving sister about faulty wiring in her current home, wiring that, when inspected, was indeed found to be dangerously defective. Another message, signed by a man who had died of food poisoning, warned his widow against purchasing meat from a particular butcher shop, a shop that was closed by health authorities 2 weeks later due to unsanitary conditions. Dr. Hartwell struggled to explain how a 14-year-old girl could possess such detailed knowledge of electrical systems, food safety, or the dozens of other technical subjects referenced in the letters. Even more puzzling was her apparent ability to predict future events with uncanny accuracy. The community divides. As word of Eliza's abilities spread throughout Harrisburg and beyond, the community found itself sharply divided in its response. The local Methodist and Presbyterian churches denounced the letters as the work of the devil, with several ministers delivering fiery sermons about the dangers of communicating with the dead. They pointed to biblical prohibitions against necromancy and urged their congregations to shun the Boone family entirely. The Catholic Church took a more measured approach, with Father Michael O'Brien of St. Patrick's Cathedral suggesting that while the phenomenon was certainly unusual, it might represent a genuine manifestation of divine will rather than demonic interference. He noted that many of the letters brought comfort to the grieving and helped resolve matters that had caused suffering among the living. The town's small but growing population of spiritualists, meanwhile, hailed Eliza as a genuine medium whose abilities offered proof of life after death. They organized séances and meetings in private homes, hoping to learn from her example and develop their own psychical abilities. The scientific community remained skeptical but intrigued. In addition to Dr. Hartwell, several other researchers visited Harrisburg to study the case, including representatives from the Society for Psychical Research in London and the American Institute for Scientific Investigation of Spiritual Phenomena. Perhaps most significantly, the letters began to affect the daily life of the community in unexpected ways. Families who had been estranged for years found themselves reconciled after receiving messages of forgiveness from deceased relatives. Business partnerships were dissolved when letters revealed long-hidden betrayals. A planned marriage was called off when the bride received a warning from her deceased grandmother about her fiancé's secret gambling debts that, upon investigation, proved to be substantial and carefully concealed. The psychological impact on the community was profound. People began to examine their own lives more carefully, knowing that their secrets might not die with them. The fear that their private thoughts and actions might someday be revealed in one of Eliza's letters created an atmosphere of nervous self-reflection that some found liberating and others found unbearable. The darker turn as summer arrived in 1890, the nature of Eliza's letters began to change in ways that alarmed even her most ardent supporters. The messages grew longer and more detailed, but they also became increasingly dark and disturbing. Where earlier communications had focused on comfort and closure, the new letters spoke of suffering, confusion, and what could only be described as torment in the afterlife. A letter supposedly from a man who had committed suicide described his existence as endless falling through gray spaces, with no ground to catch me and no sky to show me the way. Another message, signed by a woman who had died in childbirth, spoke of being trapped on the moment between life and death, feeling the pain but never finding release. Most troubling of all were the letters that seemed to come from individuals who claimed to have been murdered, but whose deaths had been recorded as accidents or natural causes. These messages contained detailed accusations against specific living individuals, describing methods of poisoning, staged accidents, and carefully planned suicides that were actually homicides. One such letter, addressed to the town's police chief, was supposedly written by a local businessman who had died the previous year when he fell down the stairs of his own home. The letter claimed that his death had been no accident, but rather the result of a deliberate push by his business partner, who had then staged the scene to look like a tragic fall. The message provided specific details about the partner's financial difficulties and his motive for murder, as well as instructions for finding hidden evidence that would prove the crime. When police investigated these claims, they discovered that the businessman's partner had indeed been embezzling from their company and faced financial ruin if his crimes were discovered. A search of the partner's home revealed blood-stained clothing hidden in the basement, along with documents showing that he had taken out a large insurance policy on his partner's life just months before the accident. The partner, confronted with this evidence, broke down and confessed to the murder, exactly as described in Eliza's letter. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our work, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Similar revelations followed in rapid succession. A woman who had supposedly died of a heart attack was revealed to have been slowly poisoned by her nephew, who stood to inherit her property. A factory worker, whose death had been attributed to an industrial accident, had actually been murdered by a supervisor who had discovered the worker's plans to report safety violations to authorities. In each case, the details provided in Eliza's letters proved to be accurate, leading to arrests, confessions, and convictions that might never have occurred otherwise. But these successes came at a terrible cost to the girl herself and to the community that had become the unwilling stage for these supernatural revelations. The physical and mental toll, as the letters grew darker and more frequent, their effect on Eliza became increasingly apparent. The pale, thin girl who had always been slight for her age began to waste away before her parents' eyes. She ate little and slept poorly, often waking with screams that she could not explain. Dark circles appeared under her eyes, and her once neat handwriting became increasingly erratic and difficult to read. Dr. Hartwell, who continued to monitor her condition, noted alarming changes in her behavior and physical appearance. She began to speak in voices that were not her own, sometimes carrying on conversations with invisible entities that only she could see. Her weight dropped precipitously, and she developed a persistent cough that no medicine seemed able to cure. Most disturbing of all, Eliza began to claim that the voices of the dead were becoming more insistent and demanding. Where once they had whispered their messages gently, she said, they now shouted and pleaded, sometimes all at once, creating a cacophony of supernatural voices that threatened to drive her to madness. They won't leave me alone, she told Dr. Hartwell during one of his visits. They crowd around me like beggars in the street, all talking at once, all demanding that I write their words. Some are kind, but others. She shuddered and wrapped her arms around herself. Others are angry, so angry. They blame me for keeping them here, for not letting them rest. But I don't know how to make them stop. Her parents, Marcus and Sarah Boone, found themselves caught between their desire to help their daughter and their growing fear of what she had become. The constant stream of visitors, researchers, curiosity seekers, and desperate individuals hoping to contact their own deceased loved ones had turned their modest home into a virtual circus. Neighbors who had once been friendly now crossed the street to avoid them, and Marcus found that his supervisors at the railroad were growing increasingly uncomfortable with his family's notoriety. Sarah Boone, in particular, seemed to age years in the span of months. The stress of caring for her increasingly fragile daughter, combined with the social ostracism the family faced, took a severe toll on her health. She began to suffer from severe headaches and nervous spells, and several neighbors reported seeing her wandering the streets at odd hours, talking to herself and wringing her hands. The final letters as autumn arrived in 1890, Eliza's condition deteriorated rapidly. The nightly writing sessions that had once lasted less than an hour now stretched until dawn, leaving her exhausted and barely coherent during the day. The letters themselves became increasingly incoherent, filled with strange symbols and words in languages that no one in Harrisburg could identify. Dr. Hartwell, growing increasingly concerned for the girl's welfare, recommended that she be taken to a private sanitarium where she could receive proper medical care away from the constant pressure of public attention. But before any such arrangements could be made, Eliza produced what would prove to be her final and most disturbing communication. On the night of October 31, 1890, Halloween, though few in the community celebrated such pagan traditions, Eliza wrote a letter unlike any that had come before. This message was not addressed to any living person, nor was it signed by any deceased individual. Instead, it was written as a direct communication from Eliza herself, though the handwriting was so distorted and erratic that it was barely recognizable as hers. The letter, which was found on her desk the following morning along with her collapsed and unconscious form, read in part, "The door has opened too wide, and I cannot close it again. They pour through like water through a broken dam, bringing with them the cold and the dark of their realm. I am no longer their voice, but their victim, no longer their messenger, but their prisoner. They speak of terrible things, wars to come, plagues that will sweep the earth, cities that will burn in fires not yet kindled. I have seen the future through their eyes, and it is a future of sorrow beyond measure. To those who read this, do not seek to follow the path I have walked. The dead should remain dead, and the living should not traffic with shadows. I have learned too late that some doors, once opened, can never be closed, and some knowledge is too terrible for mortal minds to bear. I go now to join them in their gray realm, not in death but in something worse, an existence between worlds, forever caught in the space between what was and what is to come. Remember me as I was, not as what I have become. And if you hear whispers in the dark, do not listen, do not write. Do not let them make you their voice as they have made me theirs." The letter was signed simply E.B., followed by a symbol that resembled a door standing slightly ajar. The disappearance, when Sarah Boone found her daughter unconscious at her desk that morning, Eliza was barely breathing and cold to the touch despite the warmth of the October day. Dr. Morrison, the family physician, was summoned immediately, but he could find no medical explanation for her condition. Her pulse was weak and irregular, her breathing shallow, and her skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality that he had never seen in a living person. For 3 days, Eliza lingered in this death-like state, neither fully conscious nor completely comatose. She occasionally murmured words in her sleep, but they were in languages that no one could identify, not the German or Polish spoken by many of the town's immigrants, nor the Latin that might be expected from someone with religious visions, but something altogether more ancient and unsettling. On the morning of November 3, 1890, Sarah Boone went to check on her daughter and found the bedroom empty. The window was open, though it had been securely fastened the night before, and the bed appeared to have been slept in. But there was no sign of Eliza herself, nor any indication of how she might have left the room. A search of the house and surrounding neighborhood revealed no trace of the girl. Her clothes remained in her wardrobe. Her personal belongings were undisturbed, and there were no footprints in the soft earth beneath her window. It was as if she had simply vanished into the air. The local police conducted an extensive investigation, interviewing neighbors and searching every building in a 5-mile radius. Bloodhounds were brought in from Philadelphia, but they lost her scent at the front door of the house and could pick up no trail beyond that point. Telegraph messages were sent to police departments throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states, but no trace of Eliza Boone was ever found. The aftermath and continuing mystery in the weeks following Eliza's disappearance, the mysterious letters ceased entirely. The nightly visitations that had terrorized and fascinated the community for over a year came to an abrupt end, leaving behind only memories and a collection of handwritten documents that defied explanation. Dr. Hartwell remained in Harrisburg for another month, hoping that Eliza might return or that some clue to her fate might emerge. When none did, he returned to Philadelphia with a collection of the letters and his detailed notes, intending to write a comprehensive study of the case. That study was never published. Dr. Hartwell's colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania reported that he became increasingly reclusive after his return, spending long hours in his office reading and rereading the letters he had collected. In December of 1890, Dr. Hartwell was found dead in his office, apparently of a heart attack. He was only 42 years old and had been in excellent health prior to his investigation of the Boone case. His notes and the collected letters were never found among his possessions, leading some to speculate that he had destroyed them before his death. The Boone family left Harrisburg shortly after their daughter's disappearance, selling their home for a fraction of its value and relocating to parts unknown. Neighbors reported that Marcus Boone had aged dramatically in the months following the incident, his hair turning completely gray and his once steady hands developing a persistent tremor. Sarah Boone was said to have spoken little during their final weeks in town, spending most of her time staring out the window as if watching for someone who would never return. The house on Walnut Street, where the Boone family had lived, remained empty for several years. Despite its reasonable price and good condition, no family seemed willing to occupy a dwelling with such an unsettling history. Those few who did attempt to live there reported strange occurrences, the sound of scratching from within the walls, as if someone were writing with a pen on paper, and the occasional discovery of blank sheets of paper that had been mysteriously placed throughout the house overnight. In 1895, the house was finally purchased by a family from out of state who claimed to be unaware of its history. They lived there peacefully for several months before reporting their own encounter with the supernatural. According to their account, they had awakened one morning to find a letter slipped under their front door, written in an elegant hand and addressed to the previous owner of the house, a man who had been dead for over a decade. The letter was signed E.B. Theories and explanations. In the years following Eliza's disappearance, various theories emerged to explain the extraordinary events of 1890. Skeptics suggested that the entire affair had been an elaborate hoax, perhaps orchestrated by the girl and her parents for financial gain or attention. They pointed out that the Boone family had indeed received donations from sympathetic visitors and had briefly considered charging admission to witness Eliza's writing sessions. However, This theory failed to account for the accuracy of the information contained in the letters, much of which was verified by independent sources and led to the solving of actual crimes. It also could not explain how a 14-year-old girl with limited education could have possessed such detailed knowledge of technical subjects. Historical events and private matters had been known only to the deceased and their closest confidants. Religious explanations varied depending on the denomination of the believer. Some saw Eliza as a genuine prophet, chosen by God to deliver messages of comfort and justice to the living. Others viewed her as a victim of demonic possession, corrupted by evil forces that used her innocence as a conduit for their malevolent influence. The spiritualist movement, which was gaining popularity throughout America in the late 19th century, embraced Eliza's case as proof of life after death and the possibility of communication between the worlds of the living and the dead. Mediums throughout the country claimed to have contacted Eliza's spirit, though their messages were often contradictory and generally lacking in the specific details that had characterized her original letters. Medical professionals of the era suggested various psychological explanations, from hysteria to multiple personality disorder to what would later be recognized as dissociative identity disorder. However, these diagnoses could not account for the supernatural knowledge displayed in the letters or the physical phenomena that accompanied their creation. Dr. Hartwell himself, in his private notes discovered years after his death, had developed his own theory about the case. He believed that Eliza possessed what he termed psychic permeability, an unusual sensitivity that allowed her to receive impressions and information from sources beyond normal human perception. According to his theory, the trauma of living in an industrial city surrounded by death and suffering had somehow opened channels in her mind that normally remained closed in healthy individuals. But even Dr. Hartwell acknowledged that his explanation raised more questions than it answered. If such abilities were possible, why were they so rare? What determined who possessed them and who did not? And most troubling of all, what were the long-term consequences for those unfortunate enough to develop such gifts? The legacy of Eliza Boone, the story of Eliza Boone, became part of Harrisburg folklore, passed down through generations in whispered conversations and half-remembered tales. Local historians documented the basic facts of the case, but many of the more disturbing details were gradually forgotten or deliberately omitted from official records. The letters themselves, those that survived Dr. Hartwell's mysterious disappearance, were scattered among various private collections and archives. A few found their way to universities and research institutions, where they were studied by parapsychologists and historians interested in 19th-century spiritualism. But the majority simply vanished, perhaps destroyed by families who found their contents too disturbing to preserve. In the 1920s, during the height of the spiritualist revival that followed World War I, several mediums claimed to be in contact with Eliza's spirit. These alleged communications described her existence in what she called the Gray Place, a realm between life and death where she continued to serve as a messenger for souls unable to find peace. However, skeptics noted that these later messages lacked the specific details and verifiable information that had characterized the original letters, suggesting they were more likely the product of wishful thinking than genuine supernatural contact. The house where the Boone family had lived changed hands several more times over the decades, with each new owner reporting their own strange experiences. In the 1930s, it was converted into a boarding house, but tenants complained of sleepless nights, filled with the sound of scratching within the walls. During World War II, it served briefly as a temporary shelter for defense workers, but was abandoned after several residents reported finding mysterious letters in their rooms, letters that disappeared when shown to others. In 1952, the house was finally demolished to make way for a modern apartment building. Workers on the demolition crew reported finding a hidden room behind a false wall in what had been Eliza's bedroom. The room contained a desk, an inkwell, and stacks of paper covered with writing in various hands, some recognizable as Eliza's elegant script, others in styles that seemed to belong to different eras entirely. Most of these papers were too badly deteriorated to read, but a few legible fragments were preserved. One, written in Eliza's familiar hand, contained what appeared to be a partial list of names and dates extending far into the future. Several of the names on the list were later recognized as individuals who had died in the decades following Eliza's disappearance, with dates that matched their actual deaths with eerie precision. Modern investigations and continuing mysteries interest in the Eliza Boone case experienced a revival in the 1970s, when paranormal investigators began applying modern research techniques to historical supernatural claims. Computer analysis of the surviving letters confirmed that they had indeed been written by the same hand, and linguistic analysis revealed patterns of speech and vocabulary that were consistent with the time period and social background of the alleged deceased authors. More intriguingly, researchers discovered that several of the predictions contained in Eliza's letters had proven accurate decades after they were written. A letter supposedly from a Civil War veteran had warned of a great war that will consume all nations, beginning in 1914. A remarkably precise prediction of World War I written 24 years before it occurred. Another message had described a plague that travels through the air that would kill millions in 1918, an apparent reference to the influenza pandemic that swept the globe that year. These discoveries led to renewed interest in finding any remaining letters or documents related to the case. In 1978, a construction crew renovating an old building in downtown Harrisburg discovered a trunk hidden in the basement that contained dozens of letters in Eliza's handwriting. Many of these were addressed to people who would not be born for decades after Eliza's disappearance, containing warnings about events that had not yet occurred. The discovery of these letters raised disturbing questions about the nature of time and the possibility of precognitive abilities. If Eliza had indeed been able to communicate with the dead, had she also possessed the ability to see into the future? And if so, what did her prophecies suggest about the fate of humanity in the years to come? Unfortunately, many of these later letters were written in the same deteriorated, nearly illegible script that had characterized Eliza's final communications. The few passages that could be deciphered spoke of environmental disasters, technological catastrophes, and social upheavals that painted a grim picture of the future. Whether these represented genuine prophecies or the fevered imaginings of a disturbed mind remained a matter of debate among researchers. The enduring questions more than a century after her disappearance, Eliza Boone remains one of the most puzzling figures in the annals of American supernatural history. The basic facts of her case are well documented, supported by contemporary newspaper accounts, official records, and the testimony of numerous witnesses. Yet the explanation for her extraordinary abilities remains as elusive today as it was in 1890. Modern psychology offers various theories that might account for some aspects of her case. Dissociative identity disorder could explain her apparent ability to channel different personalities, while cryptomnesia, the unconscious plagiarism of forgotten memories, might account for some of the accurate information in her letters. Hypervigilance and acute observational skills could have allowed her to notice details about her neighbors' lives that others missed, providing the raw material for her supernatural communications. But these explanations, while plausible for some aspects of the case, fail to account for its most extraordinary elements. How could a 14-year-old girl have possessed detailed knowledge of events that had occurred before her birth, in places she had never visited, involving people she had never met? How could she have accurately predicted future events with such precision? And most mysteriously of all, what happened to her on that October night when she vanished without a trace? Some researchers have suggested that Eliza's case represents evidence for what modern parapsychologists call superpsy, psychic abilities so powerful that they can transcend the normal limitations of space and time. According to this theory, Eliza's traumatic experiences and unusual sensitivity had somehow activated latent psychic abilities that allowed her to access information from across the boundaries of life and death, past and future. Others have proposed more exotic explanations, drawing on concepts from quantum physics and consciousness research. They suggest that Eliza may have been able to access what some theorists call the Akashic records, a hypothetical repository of all information that has ever existed, supposedly accessible to individuals with the proper psychic attunement. But perhaps the most disturbing possibility is that Eliza's letters were exactly what they appeared to be, genuine communications from the dead, transmitted through a living girl who had somehow become a conduit between the world of the living and whatever realm exists beyond death. If this is true, then her case raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness, the reality of life after death, and the terrible price that might be paid by those who dare to bridge the gap between worlds. The final mystery, the last confirmed sighting of anything connected to Eliza Boone, occurred in 1963, when an elderly woman in Harrisburg reported finding a letter slipped under her door during the night. The letter was addressed to her late husband and signed with the familiar E.B. that had marked Eliza's communications 7 decades earlier. The woman, Miss Dorothy Kellerman, was the granddaughter of one of the original recipients of Eliza's letters in 1890. She had grown up hearing stories about the mysterious girl who wrote messages from the dead, but had always assumed they were merely family folklore. The letter she found, however, contained specific details about her husband's final illness that no living person could have known, written in the same elegant script that had characterized the original communications. Miss Kellerman preserved the letter until her own death in 1987, when it was discovered among her possessions by relatives who donated it to the Dauphin County Historical Society. Analysis of the paper and ink confirmed that they were consistent with materials available in the early 1960s, though the handwriting appeared identical to samples of Eliza's script from the 1890s. This final letter contained a brief postscript that has haunted researchers ever since. The door remains open, and I remain its guardian. When the time comes for the great revealing, I will write once more. Until then, I watch and wait in the gray place between worlds, where the dead dream of life and the living dream of death. What do you think really happened here? Leave your theories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale, subscribe, hit the bell, and share with someone who loves history's darkest mysteries. See you in the next video. Epilogue. The Watchers in the Gray. Today, the site where the Boone house once stood is occupied by a modern office building, its sterile glass and steel facade giving no hint of the supernatural drama that once unfolded there. But local residents still report occasional strange occurrences, letters that appear overnight in mailboxes, addressed to people who died long ago, written in an elegant hand that seems to belong to another century. The Dauphin County Historical Society maintains a small collection of materials related to the Eliza Boone case, though many of the most significant documents remain in private hands or have been lost to time. Researchers continue to investigate the case, drawn by the tantalizing possibility that it might offer genuine evidence for life after death or psychic abilities that transcend our current understanding of human consciousness. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Eliza Boone lies not in the letters she wrote or the mysteries she left behind, but in the questions her case raises about the nature of reality itself. In an age when science has mapped the human genome and sent probes to distant planets, her story reminds us that there are still mysteries in our world that resist easy explanation, shadows at the edges of our understanding that hint at realities beyond our current comprehension. Whether Eliza Boone was a genuine medium, a troubled girl with extraordinary psychological abilities, or something else entirely, her case continues to challenge our assumptions about the boundaries between life and death, past and future, the known and the unknowable. In the end, perhaps that is her true gift to us, not the letters she wrote for the dead, but the questions she left for the living. Questions that continue to echo through the years like whispers from the gray place between worlds. And somewhere, in the space between what we know and what we fear to know, the Watchers wait, their pale hands poised over blank pages, ready to write the next chapter in a story that may never truly end.